Why would a woman obey phone commands from a stranger to strip search an innocent employee?
She pretty much got this victim trapped in the office, totally naked.
But unless you're put in that situation, how do you know what you would do? You don't.
Guilty. Guilty, sir. Guilty. Guilty.
Why would 4 young men watch their friend die when they could have intervened to save him?
Matt, stop breathing.
This guy is in real trouble. You call 911.
I had it typed into my phone. All I had to do was press the green button. I hit the red button and canceled it out.
When good people do nothing, evil prevails.
How could soldiers with good service records suddenly descend into barbaric behavior?
Sometimes you cross a line, and it's a thin line at any time that can be crossed by anybody if placed in certain conditions.
The answer to these questions can be found in the human behavior experiments.
Hands off the door. Hey, I don't want anybody back. You're back in your clothes, you prison.
In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an electronic box that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable. How the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? These are questions that concern me.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
Milgram's experiment was rigged. The so-called learner was part of the experiment. The real subject was the teacher.
Shock of 75 volts.
Now, as teacher, you are seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Now the question is, how far will you proceed on the generator before you turn to the experimenter and refuse to go any further?
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
To complete the test.
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. As I said, the experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
I'm not going to go any further.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
165 volts. Time.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the shock board, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
And who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head, just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not,
But he might be dead in there.
Although Milgram's experiment took place over 40 years ago, his findings on obedience to authority are still relevant to us today. A series of strange events recently confirmed Milgram's theories about obedience. Targeting fast food restaurants across the country, a con man telephoned restaurant managers and convinced them to strip search and sometimes sexually abuse their employees. The mystery is not in the con man, but in the victims. Why would they obey?
This person was so convincing, people saw him as a legitimate authority. I think we have probably the closest thing that we have to Milgram experiment today in these strip searches.
The most famous of these incidents took place at a McDonald's in Mount Washington, Kentucky.
There was a videotape security camera had filmed. We didn't hear what the instructions were, but due to the actions that were had taken place, what the victim was doing in the video and stuff, it was pretty evident what each instruction was.
An anonymous caller pretending to be a police officer told the assistant manager that an employee had stolen some money.
He said, "I'm Officer Scott," and he said, "I'm with the police department. I'm investigating a complaint." It went directly from a theft into a drug thing. So I was asked to search her clothing. You know, he would tell me, take her shoes, click them, take her shirt, shake it out. I know how it seems to people, but you weren't on the phone with him. The man has convinced 70 to 100 other places the very same thing. He's very good at what he does. Very good.
A series of strip search hoaxes played out in fast food restaurants across the country confirmed the findings of the Milgram experiment on obedience to authority.
He sounded like a police officer. And I'm thinking, okay, you know, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do.
He was getting some kind of satisfaction by being an authoritative figure and telling people what to do, and then realizing by the phone conversation that they were actually doing what he said.
He's telling me that I needed to get someone to sit with her while he goes and gets somebody to come in to pick her up.
The caller then asked the manager if she was married or had a boyfriend. She said that she had a fiance. Then the caller asked if she could have her fiance come to the restaurant and assist her with the strip search of the victim.
He says, well, why don't you have him come up and sit there? I mean, you can trust him. So called Wes, my fiance, we were going to get married, and asked him if he would come up.
The manager goes about doing her duties of running the restaurant and leaves the fiance there in the office, and then the caller starts giving instructions over the phone of things that he wants the victim to do and what he wants the fiance to tell her to do. Have her remove her apron and instructed to do jumping jacks and jog in place and several more things. She was still in high school. The kind of person she was actually graduating the top 10 in her class. And she was scared of being in trouble with the police, so she sort of just went along and did whatever the fiance told her to do because she didn't want to be in trouble for anything.
During all this time, I'm working. I'm running the floor, I'm getting change. And then when I would walk into the office to get the change or whatever I had to get, Wes would be sitting where he was when I left, and she was sitting where she was. and no one said anything.
After over 2.5 hours, Summer's fiancé, Walter Nix, did something that was unthinkable. Complying with the instructions of the caller, he ordered the employee to perform a sexual act.
A lot of people, look at you and go, well, you're a nut, you should be strung up. I've had it even said to me. You look back on it and you say, I wouldn't have done it, but unless you're put in that situation at that time, how do you know what you would do? You don't. You don't.
What are the pressures that compel us to obey orders, even when we know that they are wrong? What pressures would keep a friend from calling for help, even when it was a matter of life and death? In 2005, 4 fraternity brothers watched and did nothing to help as their close friend, 21-year-old Matthew Carrington, died in front of them.
I'll live with the consequences of behavior for the rest of my life. My actions killed a good person.
Nothing I can say here today will bring back Matthew Carrington or lessen the grief that his family feels.
His death was preventable, and I will live with the guilt for the rest of my life.
Why did these 4 boys do nothing?
Every time I think about it, the feelings rush back, and the idea of what if just stands there in the corner, just not leaving. It's always there. I had no doubt that if I would have known what I know now, that I could have stopped it.
This story is not unique, but it raises a question. Is there something in human nature that can keep us from helping? In 1964, 38 New Yorkers watched through their windows as one of their neighbors was brutally murdered. Her name was Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old woman.
The Genovese incident, where a young woman coming home late at night from her work was assaulted by somebody who was one of those random, crazy people.
Kitty was running up the block, and Winston Mosley ran after her until she reached the midpoint of the block, almost directly under this street light. Mosley caught up with her and stabbed her 4 times in the back. Her screams were loud, unmistakable, and reverberated throughout the entire area.
Lights went on in the windows around the courtyard, so we know that people were seeing this. Nobody called the police.
Somebody who lived on the 7th floor opened his window and yelled out, "What's going on down there?" When Mosley heard somebody yelling out, he ran back to his car. Kitty was still alive. She managed to get up. She staggers around the corner here, still screaming. People in that building heard her as well, and she collapses inside this hallway.
After stabbing Kitty another 8 times in this very hallway, the killer ran away, leaving Kitty to bleed to death. Eventually, a neighbor called the police, but it was too late. Kitty died before the ambulance could get her to the hospital.
That shocked the city. Now, it's not that a person got murdered that shocked the city. That happens, sadly. It's that a person got murdered and her neighbors watched and nobody did anything. Bibb Latney and I, we read about the murder, as did everybody else. Here we were 2 young social psychologists starting our research careers. We knew about Stanley Milgram's set of experiments on obedience to authority. And we started to think about, in an offhand way, what could have produced the Genovese effect.
Perhaps Kitty Genovese might have been alive today if fewer people had seen her.
There were perhaps 38 people who could have responded, but each were looking to see what these other people were doing.
First of all, I would like to thank the 2 of you for being here today to help out in this study.
To test their theory, Darley and Latney conducted an experiment. This woman believes she is hearing someone on the other end of the phone having a seizure.
I could really use some help. Hello? Could somebody help?
knew there was nobody else but you to help, you got up, you opened the door of your room, and you headed off to find the person. On the other hand, if there were 3 or 4 other people present who you heard,
We'd like to thank the 3 of you for being here today to help us with the study. We are interested in learning.
you are much less likely to respond yourself.
Somebody give me a little help here. I'm having a real problem right now. Help me out.
The responsibility any individual feels for helping is diffused when there are other people who could also help. So what can we say back to the bystanders in the Genovese situation? The first thing we can say, I think, is they got a bum rap. They were reacting the way that you or me might react in those situations. There have been many incidents like the Genovese incident since then, and there have been many incidents in which people who could help don't help.
A makeshift memorial of flowers and candles is placed outside the Chi Tau fraternity house for Matthew Carrington. Police say the 21-year-old Chico State student was in the basement of this house taking part in a fraternity event at 5 a.m. Wednesday morning when his body gave out.
Matt didn't have to die that night. Could have all been so different. Could have all been from the very beginning when they were all down there. When there was a room full of guys. It went wrong before they all left.
Matthew Carrington joined a fraternity and was undergoing hazing during the spring semester of his junior year.
Pledge class 2004.
Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And these are our little pledge brothers right here.
He wanted to join because he would get to meet people. He's kind of shy, you know, networking and such when you're older. I mean, you've got brothers and houses in every college all over the country, so. They did some pretty silly things, more embarrassing than causing anybody any harm. Like wearing a miniskirt out in the intersection or switching your t-shirt with a homeless guy and putting his shirt on. But it was nothing that was gonna get anybody hurt.
Oh, isn't that sweet?
How did these seemingly harmless pranks escalate to the point where Matthew died?
Basically, it was the third night, what the fraternity called Inspiration Week, what the pledges call Hell Week. The pledges, Mike and Matt, were brought into the basement, and the first thing they did was undergo some grueling physical calisthenics. The young men were then given a 5-gallon water jug, which in itself weighed about 42 pounds, and were told to stand up on a narrow bench, stand on one foot, and to drink as much as they possibly could.
Matthew at some point became nauseated, vomited, became increasingly confused. The kidneys can only handle so much water, and indeed you can poison yourself.
When you're drinking water and you're acting drunk, okay, something's not right. You know? When you're slurring your words, when you're, you know, you can't manipulate things like you normally, something's wrong.
Gabriel Mastretti and J.P. Fickus came in at some point and they were both intoxicated. Mastretti was excessively intoxicated and they basically took over.
Actually, to tell you the truth, I don't remember most of it. Fortunately, I was pretty intoxicated when it happened. I remember making him do push-ups.
Matt was at a point where he couldn't do any more push-ups. He just all of a sudden dropped, and it just seemed like his whole body just tensed up.
You've got, well, at this point, 4 boys down there. It just makes me sick that they didn't think. They didn't think something's wrong. So why can't someone say stop?
What could happen is if one person says, this guy is in real trouble, you call 911, you do this, you do that. Everybody will buy that definition, will start to react, will be helpful. The thing is balanced on a knife edge, but sometimes it falls and nothing happens.
His hips moved a little bit and he just seized up. And Mike said, oh my God, I think he bit his tongue. And then he said, somebody needs to call an ambulance. I was turning on my cell phone when I was not walking down the stairs and was typing in 911 when I saw Mike at the bottom of the stairs. I had it typed into my phone. All I had to do was press the green button. And he said, it's okay, you don't need to call 911. Matt's just sleeping. You know, I hit the red button and canceled it out. And he was snoring. It just sounded like he was snoring.
I remember that thoroughly. I remember the sound of him snoring. I remember thinking, no, he's sleeping.
The snoring was certainly not sleeping. It would have been a result of water intoxication and a pulmonary edema, which is basically the lungs filling with fluid. Approximately an hour after he had been left to sleep it off, he was not breathing.
They do nothing for an hour while they have him lay there. Then they realize he's not breathing. Then all of a sudden it's like, call 911. Well, God, at this point they do, but at this point now, it's too late.
Matthew was pronounced dead approximately 27 minutes after arrival in the emergency department.
When we got there, they took me and Debbie in the back, and we were still hoping that when they pulled that sheet over his head, it was going to be another kid, not yours. Just as bad as that sounds, there was just a chance it wasn't our son. And as soon as they pulled the sheet up and you seen his hairdo, you knew it was him.
And she's screaming, no, not Matt, not Matt.
The four ringleaders in the fraternity hazing and torture death of 21-year-old Chico State student Matthew Carrington accepted responsibility. All four, some through tears, pleading guilty.
Guilty. Guilty, sir. Guilty. Guilty.
I believe that there's all different kinds of people, and that a certain kind of people take charge in situations. Unfortunately for Matt, none of us were the type of person who took charge and told people what to do. We just found ourselves looking at each other, waiting for someone to step up, and nobody did.
What it's hard for us to realize is the power that situations have over us to cause us to act in certain ways. It was not the case that they had been horrible moral failures. It's the case that they're like the rest of us, caught up in situations, influenced by the situations, reacting.
In 1971, in the basement of the psychology department of Stanford University, a mock prison was created. It rivaled all social psychology experiments in controversy.
Shortly after I finished this Stanford prison study, Milgram embraced me and said, "I'm so happy that you did this." He said, because now you can take off some of the heat that he's had to bear alone of having done the most unethical study.
Although this experiment is over 30 years old, its enduring power has been underscored by the events at Abu Ghraib.
When we got to Abu Ghraib, it was eerie. People were being told to rough up Iraqis that wouldn't cooperate. I mean, they're torturing, they're abusing detainees. You're looking at the situation thinking, they've condoned this, but why? And if it wouldn't have been for those photos, no one would have ever believed what was going on over there.
When I first saw the pictures, immediately a sense of familiarity struck me, because I knew that I had been there before. I'd been in this type of situation. I knew what was going on in my mind.
The photographs were strikingly familiar to the photographs that we had taken, many of the photographs I had taken in the prison study.
We didn't do any of the stuff that you see in Abu Ghraib where they, get into a big pile or something like that, but I certainly subjected them to all kinds of humiliations. I don't know where I would have stopped myself. Given enough time, we could have got there.
When the images of the abuse and torture in Abu Ghraib were revealed, immediately the military went on the defensive, saying, it's a few bad apples. When we see somebody doing bad things, we assume they're bad people to begin with. But what we know in our study is there are a set of social psychological variables that can make ordinary people do things they never could imagine doing.
At Abu Ghraib, ordinary people perpetrated extraordinary abuses. To understand why, it helps to reach back to the lessons of Zimbardo's experiment, how people respond to a cruel environment without clear rules.
I think he and everybody else who came down into that situation got caught up into that situation. And the sense that this was an experiment, that began to fade away. It became just life.
We frankly didn't anticipate what was going to happen. And we tried to really test the power of the environment to change and transform otherwise normal people, much as Milgram had changed or transformed otherwise normal people in an obedience situation. We wanted to do it in a prison-like situation.
Over 70 men volunteered for Zimbardo's experiment.
And they completed a battery of psychological tests. And we picked 24 who were the most normal and most healthy. Half are going to be guards, half are going to be prisoners. And it's like flipping a coin. And heads, this one's a guard, this one's a prisoner. So at the beginning, there's no difference in the kinds of people who are in your two groups.
When we were given our jobs as guards, we were issued a uniform, which was a plain sort of khaki or lighter colored uniform.
And then we gave them the symbols of power, handcuffs, a whistle, a big billy club. And then the other thing we gave them were silver reflecting sunglasses.
When you have mirror sunglasses on, then nobody can see your eyeballs. I think that anytime you put on what essentially is a mask, and you mask your identity, then it allows you to behave in ways that you would not behave if you didn't have the mask on.
To make it more realistic, I had arranged with this Palo Alto Police Department to make mock arrests.
When I was arrested, it was a surprise to me. I didn't think I was going to be brought to an actual police station. I didn't think I was going to go through a booking process.
The guards then put a blindfold on them, stripped them naked, and then they put them in dresses, smocks with no underpants. Each had a number that replaced their name. They had to know the number. They could only be referred to by that number. And they had a chain on one foot, which was put there to remind them at all times of their loss of freedom. So all of these things produces a sense of being dehumanized. On the first day, I said, this is not going to work. I mean, the guards felt awkward giving orders, and they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers, and the prisoners start giggling.
I don't want anybody laughing. 3, 2, 1.
And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoner's named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be.
I see in the future that you do work when you're told. Say it again. Say bless you, correctional officer.
I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
We did have to do things like push-ups. We would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions. We did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that, and they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as a kind of an affront to their authority, and they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. You know, he's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes.
Hands off the door.
There was the first evening, a kind of rebellion that took place.
The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells and said, we refuse to come out. They took off their numbers. They didn't want to be de-individuated. They started cursing the guards to their face. And the key turning point was the guards began to think of them as dangerous prisoners. And so the guards formulated a plan, used fire extinguishers, took the doors down, dragged the prisoners out, stripped them naked, and essentially broke the rebellion in a purely physical way.
From that point on, the study was as remarkable a series of events as I've ever seen.
On the second day of Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, the guards quashed the prisoner rebellion.
They punished them by putting them in solitary confinement, which was a small closet. You could squat or stand, but you couldn't sit, and it was dark and dank, actually.
Every hour, every day, there's a teeny little bit more of an increment. And they're stepping up, taunting the prisoners. They're stepping up. The count's not letting them sleep. They're stepping up. I don't think from 1 minute to the next, the people who are in it see the change and see the difference.
And then the next key thing happened beside the rebellion. Prisoner 8612, he was the first one to have an emotional breakdown.
I feel really inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I'm up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm up inside! Out! Now!
At the time, if you had questioned me about the effect I was having, I would say, well, they must be a wimp. They're weak, or they're faking. Because I wouldn't have believed that what I was doing could actually cause somebody to have a nervous breakdown. It was just us sort of getting our jollies with it. Let's be like puppeteers here. Let's make these people do things.
What if I told you to get down on that floor and the floor? What would you do then?
The guards now began to escalate their use of power. Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands. They now taunt, humiliate, degrade the prisoners in front of each other, and they exert arbitrary control over the prisoners.
They keep thinking of more and more unusual things to do. And very soon after the fourth day, things begin to turn sexual.
You be the bride of Frankenstein, and you be Frankenstein. I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love the true man.
If you want to fully sort of humiliate somebody, then you want to get them in those things where their biggest fears are. And a lot of us have a lot of sexual hang-ups, and so that was part of that effort to humiliate them even further.
Get up, bro. I love you, true man. I love you, true man. You smile, true man, please. You get down here and do 10 push-ups.
Every day after that, another prisoner broke down in a similar way. Extreme stress reaction. We released another one on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Nobody who was in that study could deny that the prisoner breakdowns were genuine. They were scary to see. They were upsetting to us. They were unexpected, but they were very clearly the real thing. Something was happening that we were no longer in control of.
On the fifth day of the study, Zimbardo invited his girlfriend, recent psychology graduate Christina Maslach, to visit the mock prison.
I had heard bits and pieces from Phil about what was going on. And then when I was down there that evening, it really was kind of a wow. The thing that really got to me was when some of the guards took the prisoners down the hall to the men's room.
She looks out and sees a line of prisoners with paper bags over their heads, each one holding the other one's shoulder.
And they're leading them down the hall. And Phil comes over and look, my God, look at that. And I looked up and something about it just, again, it was the dehumanizing, demeaning kind of treatment. I couldn't watch it.
And she said, it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. And she got tears in her eyes. I said, what? And she runs out. And I'm furious. I'm saying, look, this is, I run outside, we have this big argument. I'm saying, look, this is dynamics of human behavior. Look, it's fascinating, the power of the situation. So I'm giving her all the psychological basis, and what kind of psychologist are you? You don't appreciate this. And she said,
I don't understand. You're a stranger to me. I don't understand this. How could you not see what I see? I mean, you're a caring, compassionate person. I know you from all these other things. Something's gone wrong here.
And then the next thing she said, which had an equally big impact, is, I'm not sure I want to, have anything to do with you if this is the real you. And that was like a slap in the face, because what she was saying is, you've changed. The power of the situation has transformed you from the person I thought I knew to this person that I don't know. And at that moment I said, wow, you're right. We got to end it.
After only 6 days, Dr. Zimbardo shut down his experiment.
What makes this study interesting, and what makes the Milgram study interesting, it's really about the transformation of human character.
Zimbardo decided to cut short his experiment due to the growing hostility of many of the guards.
People can be seduced into doing things they never thought they could. There are interesting parallels that are coming up now with Abu Ghraib.
At Abu Ghraib, standard operating procedures were changed. Normally, military guards are supposed to protect prisoners. Suddenly, they were asked to soften them up for interrogators.
We were never trained to be prison guards. The higher-ups said, use your imagination. Break them. We want them broke by the time we get back. As soon as we'd have prisoners come in, sandbags instantly over their head. And they would flexi-cuff them, throw them down to the ground. Some would be stripped. It was told to all of us, they're nothing but dogs. So you start breeding that picture to people, then all of a sudden you start looking at these people as less than human, and you start doing things to them you would never dream of. And that's where it got scary. Tier 1A was where a lot of the stuff started happening, and that's what Tier Specialist Grainer was in charge of. One evening, after he got off of his shift, he was hoarse. I said, Grainer, are you getting sick? And he goes, no. And I said, well, what's going on? And he says, well, I'm having to yell and do things to detainees that I feel are morally and ethically wrong. What do you think I should do? I said, then don't do them. And he goes, I don't have a choice. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, every time a bomb goes off outside the wire or outside the fence, they come in and they tell me that's another American losing their life, and unless you help us, their blood's on your hands as well. So early on in October, what I saw whenever I walked up to the tier was 2 soldiers that I had no idea who they were. They had 2 naked detainees handcuffed to prison cells. They were telling him to confess, confess, confess. He would swat him on the behind with a water bottle. So then after they did that, they handcuffed him together in what appeared to be sexual position. I've never been trained in an interrogation, but I definitely didn't think that this is the way interrogation should be. And so I reported it to my lieutenant, basically, telling him military intelligence is doing some pretty weird things with naked detainees, and he seemed not to care.
Whenever there's a system, there are perpetrators of evil. There's the people who do bad things, like at Abu Ghraib, the guards. But the top administration gives permission, either implicitly or explicitly. They didn't say put them in a pyramid, but they gave them general permission to do whatever they had to do to get confessions.
They may well be given missions in connection with this overall task and strategy. We also have to work the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows.
I can't think of a worse thing for somebody who is in charge of an environment like that, or in charge of people who work in an environment like that, to say, it's time to take the gloves off and go to the dark side. Those kinds of institutional environments create pressures on people to head to the dark side anyway. I mean, we learned this in the prison study. Those environments elicit the worst from good people.
My guess is that 99.999% of our armed forces behave admirably at all times. But it's like the rest of society. There will be a few bad apples that will conduct themselves in ways that we're not proud of.
Were there a few bad apples? No. What was bad was the barrel. Who made the barrel? This whole chain of command.
I feel terrible about what happened to these Iraqi detainees. They were in U.S. custody. Our country had an obligation to treat them right, to treat them as human beings. We didn't do that. That was wrong.
Prior to the Abu Ghraib scandal, Donald Rumsfeld had personally approved a menu of interrogation techniques, including dogs, stress positions, and nudity, that violated long-standing military rules.
When you follow an order, you got to be held accountable as well. But the ones that hold the key to that door, the ones that ask you to walk through that door, hold a higher accountability because they know better.
I know the situation very closely now because I was an expert witness for one of those guards, Chip Frederick, exemplary soldier, 9 medals, model father, husband, patriotic, normal, healthy, no sadistic tendencies. Nothing that would indicate he was anything other than an ordinary good guy. And he gets into this place and he is totally corrupted.
Sometimes you cross a line, and it's a thin line at any time that can be crossed by anybody if placed in certain conditions.
I think it's a hard conclusion from all of the research evidence to sort of say there's nothing inherent in who you are that would necessarily say, I'm safe, I will never cross the line. That research was done 30-something years ago. This is not news, The lessons that were learned, it's been in textbooks, it's been taught in psychology courses. Other research, Milgram, all of these other studies are pointing to those same conclusions.
It is the rare person who's able to be in that situation and resist. It's the majority who conform, who comply, who obey authority, who do these things. And that's what nobody wants to hear. We want to all think we're heroes. If we were in that situation, we'd be different. Maybe that's true. But heroes are rare in any society. They are the exception. The rule is the majority. The rule is the base rate is what the average person would do. And so the big message from the Stanford Prison Experiment, big message from the Milgram Obedience Study, from many of these other studies, is that if you imagine yourself in those being a participant in the studies, you have to say, it's likely I would do what the majority did. And I'm not that special. I'm an ordinary person. They were ordinary people.